Welcome to Chromaticus. I'm Jay Junta, and today we're going to look at how to properly add chord extensions to your chords. If you want to add some nice richness and color into your harmony, you can use what are called chord extensions, also known as tensions. But how do you know which tensions go with which chords? Well, there are a couple of basic rules that you can use in order to figure that out. And a lot of these rules can then be broken in certain contexts, but I'm going to cover all of that as well. The first rule is that your chord extensions or tensions should come from the scale that you're using. After all, harmony is just a vertical expression of a scale, which is linear by nature. So your tensions should be diatonic to the scale that goes with the chord. The next rule is that tensions go above the chord sound. You don't want to add a tension to a chord and then put it down in the bass. It's going to end up sounding like a different chord than what was intended. So tensions always go above chord sound. The next rule is that typically tensions are a whole step above a chord tone. The exception, of course, being the dominant chord, which can take pretty much any tension, and there are other exceptions depending on context, but hang on to that thought for now. And the last rule is that you don't want to unintentionally alter the function of the chord. This, of course, only applies to functional harmony, so there's plenty of exceptions to that rule as well. And I am going to go over basic chord function just in case you're not sure of what I mean by that. But first, let's look at the origins of the tensions and why we call them the 9th, the 11th, and the 13th. This is our C major scale in 2 octaves. If you start on the first degree of the scale, also called the root or the tonic, and you stack in thirds, a third up from C would be E, and a third up from E would be G. This is your C major triad. If you continue stacking, another third will give you the 7th, which would give you a C major 7 chord. If you continue stacking in thirds in the next octave, that is where you get the terms 9th, 11th, and 13th. And you'll notice that the 9th, or D, is the same as the 2nd degree in the lower octave. The F, or the 11th, is the same as the 4th, and A, or the 13th, is the same as the 6th degree. If you wanted to add the 2nd degree, or D, to a C major triad, you would write C add 2. And if you wanted a triad with the 6th degree, you could write C add 6, or just C6. But going into the next octave is where things get a little bit tricky because there are a lot of different ways to notate chords. My preferred method is to write the chord sound first, either C major or C major 7, and then any tensions or alterations to the chord tones you would put in parentheses. So if I wanted a C major 7 chord with a 9th, I would write it like this. And if I wanted a 9th and a 13th, I would write it like this. In this lesson, we're mostly going to be talking about tonal music and functional chords. So let's go over basic chord function derived from tonal systems. Tonal systems are asymmetrical, which is the basis of that tonal gravity. Asymmetrical meaning that there's whole steps and half steps, and the half steps are really what define the system. This half step, or minor second from B up to C, is the strongest gravitational pull into the tonic that we have. This is what defines the tonality. And that half step motion is mirrored in the 4 to 3, which is what defines the modality, that being major or minor. If you look at the chords with tonic function, the C chord being the 1 chord, the 3 chord, and the 6 chord, these chords with tonic function feel like they're at rest. They don't feel like they want to resolve somewhere else. The 4th degree of the scale, the F, is what defines a subdominant function. So the 2 chord and the 4 chord, which have subdominant function, both contain the note F. This creates a little bit of instability and makes them feel like they want to move somewhere. So that's what I mean when I mention that rule about not wanting to accidentally create a different function of a chord. In other words, if you have a C major chord that has tonic function, you don't want to add an F to it and create subdominant function. And the G dominant 7 chord, which has dominant function, contains the F as well as the B, which creates a tritone interval. And that G dominant 7 chord resolving to the 1 chord is really the foundation of tonal music. Now that we've covered basic chord function, let's look at the different possibilities for adding tensions to each chord. If you look at the C major scale in reference to a C major chord, you'll see that the C, the E, the G, and the B are the chord tones that make up a C major 7 chord. The note D is a whole step above a chord tone, or a major 9th if you're in the next octave, and it doesn't confuse the function of the chord. So D, or the 9th, is an acceptable tension to add to a C major 7 chord. And you could also add the D to a triad if you wanted to. You'll notice F is blacked out, and the reason is because it is a half step or a minor 9th above a chord tone. It also would confuse the function of the chord, so this is what we would call a harmonic avoid note. It's called harmonic avoid note because you can't use it harmonically, meaning in the chord, but you can use it melodically. And the 13th, or A, is also a whole step or a major 9th above a chord tone, and also doesn't confuse the function of the chord. so that it's also an acceptable tension tone. You could also add the A to a triad and you'd have a C6 chord. This is really common, especially if you have a root in the melody, because if C is your melody note and you have a C major 7 chord, then that melody is going to clash with that half step between the B and the C. So it's particularly common to use a C6 chord when you have a root in the melody, although you could also just use it because you like the sound. Let's take a quick listen to the sound of each chord. Now, if we look at the D Dorian chord scale, which you would use for a 2 chord, D, F, A, and C make up the chord tones of a D minor 7th chord. The E is a whole step above a chord tone, so that is an available tension. And the G is also a whole step above a chord tone and is available as a tension. Now, the B is where things start to get a little bit muddy. B is a whole step above the 5th of the chord, so you might expect it to be an available tension. But D minor has an F in the chord. And if you add a B to that, you now have the tritone interval in the chord, which signals dominant function. As our ears get more and more accepting of dissonance naturally over time, and as players experiment more and expand their harmonic vocabularies, rules like this kind of do change. So in more modern jazz, you will sometimes see a D minor 13 chord, especially if it's in the melody. But if you played this right before a G7 chord, it kind of gives away the whole game. And it's not a really good sound from a D minor 7 13 going to a G dominant 7 because you've already played the tritone. Not that you can't do it, you can do whatever you want, but it's a very lackluster sound. So if you are going to use a D minor 7 13 chord in the context of C major, it might be best to avoid using the dominant chord near that chord. But then that begs the question, does it really sound like a 2 chord, or does it sound more like some kind of 5 chord in second inversion? That 13th or the 6th degree of the scale is the characteristic note of the Dorian mode. So if you're not writing tonal functional music, but are instead writing some type of D Dorian modal music, that would be a great time to use that chord. You could vamp on a D minor 7 13 chord for a while and solo over it with your Dorian mode. The scale for the 3 chord is called E Phrygian. The notes E, G, B, and D making up the E minor 7th chord. The note F is a half step above the root, so that is a harmonic avoid note. The 11th, or A, is a whole step above a chord tone, and it doesn't confuse the function of the chord, so this is an available tension. And C is also a half step above a chord tone, so it is not available as a tension. So in a tonal functional context, the only available tension for the 3 chord is the 11th. Just in case you were wondering, the F is the characteristic note of the E Phrygian modal sound. So if you were writing modal music, you would actually need the F to really signal that Phrygian sound. So in a modal context, you could use this chord and E7 flat 9 sus4 to signal that modal Phrygian sound. As you might have noticed by now, a lot of these rules that we're talking about, you can easily break them when you start writing modal music or non-functional music. They really just apply to tonal functional music. Next, we have the F Lydian chord scale for our 4 chord, with the notes F, A, C, and E making up the F major 7 chord. The note G is a whole step or major 9th above F, so that has an available tension. The note B is also a whole step above A, and it is an available tension, but you have to also be careful with this chord because, again, that B now combined with the note F creates a tritone, which typically signals dominant function. So if you play this chord right before a 5 chord, again, you're kind of giving away that dominant sound before you get to the dominant chord. If you're going to use this chord, I would also use the same caution as you did with the 2 chord, and I would not use this chord before or after the dominant 5 chord. There was a time where this tension sharp 11 was not used on the 4 chord, but again, our ears grow more accustomed to tension over time, and styles do change. This particular chord with the sharp 11, I feel like I do see it more often outside of tonal music. If you look at the song Iris by Wayne Shorter, there are two major 7 sharp 11 chords in it, but neither are functioning as a 4 chord. He's sort of just playing around with different sonic atmospheres. And the last note, D, or the 13th, is also a whole step above a chord tone, and that is also available as a tension. So you'll notice the Lydian chord scale doesn't have any avoid notes. Next we have G Mixolydian for our dominant 5 chord. The notes G, B, D, and F making up the chord tones. The note A is a major 2nd or major 9th above a chord tone, so that is an available tension on the G dominant 7 chord. The note C is a half step above a chord tone, so that is a harmonic avoid note. But if you're using a G dominant sus4 chord where you're suspending the B and using C in its place, then C would be a chord tone. And the note E is a whole step above D, so that is also an available tension. Those are the diatonic tensions to this key. But a dominant 7 chord, you can really alter any tension. They can take flat 9s, which is a half step above the root. They can take sharp 9s, flat 5s, flat 13s. But I'm going to hold off on showing you that until we get to the minor keys, where a lot of those alterations come from. For now, let's just listen to the diatonic tensions in the key of C major. A natural minor or A Aeolian chord scale is used on our 6 chord. The notes A, C, E, and G making up the A minor 7 chord, and B is a whole step above A, so that is an available tension. D is a whole step above C, so that is also an available tension. But the F is a half step above the 5th of the chord, so that is a harmonic avoid note. And just a reminder, harmonic avoid notes are just for the chords. You can still use that note melodically. And the last chord scale in the key of C major is your B Locrian chord scale, which works over your B minor 7 flat 5 chord. The notes B, D, F, and A making up the chord tones. The note C is a half step above B, so that is not an available tension. Although some players will borrow the chord scale from the 6th degree of melodic minor, which is Locrian natural 2, which would give you in this case a C sharp, which would be a whole step above the root, and then that would be an available tension. But just sticking to the diatonic chord scale for the moment, C is not available. E is a whole step above a chord tone, so that is an available tension, and G is also a whole step above F, so that is an available tension. Now let's look at minor key harmony. We'll start off with the A natural minor scale, since it contains the same notes and therefore the same chords as the C major scale. If you take the C major scale and shift the key center to A, you get what's called the A natural minor scale. It contains the same 7 notes as C major, which means you get the same 7 chords. But all that tonal gravity is now shifting towards A. A is the tonic note, and the A minor 7 is now the 1 chord instead of the 6 chord. Notice that now the 5 chord is a minor 7 chord instead of a dominant chord. And now that G7 that was the 5 chord is now the flat 7 chord. So on the flat 7th degree, you have a dominant chord that is dominant in quality only because it lacks the leading tone of A. Just like B was the leading tone a half step below C that had that strong sort of gravitational pull into the tonic, a half step below A would be G sharp. And this is where minor key harmony becomes much more complex, when you start borrowing chords from other parallel minor keys, such as melodic minor, harmonic minor, and Dorian minor. There are different tonic and subdominant chords that you get depending on which parent scale or mode you're borrowing your chords from. I'm not going to cover every single one because it gets really redundant from what I've already covered. But the main difference is that in your minor keys, you can borrow chords from a lot of different minor scales, so your tensions change depending on which scale you're using. Remember, tensions are diatonic to your chord scales. Now, there are a few chords that you don't get in major keys that I think are worth covering. The first one is called the minor major 7th chord. The A minor major 7 chord can come from A harmonic minor, or it can come from A melodic minor, since both scales contain the minor 3rd and the major 7th. The difference is the F natural in harmonic minor versus the F sharp in melodic minor. You can use either scale, but let's look at melodic minor since it has no avoid notes. The B is a whole step above A, so that is available as a tension. Now D and F sharp are both whole steps above chord tones, but they do also both create tritones of other dominant chords. The D creating a tritone with G sharp, and the F sharp creating a tritone with C. So why are these available as tensions if they're creating tritones of other dominant chords? I think part of the reason is because the A minor major 7 chord is already a pretty tense chord. You have a major 7th between the root and the 7th degree, and you have an augmented 5th between the 3rd and the 7th degree. And the other reason is that if you remember back to the Dorian example with the 13th, when that sounded like a dominant chord, the root of that 2 chord is the 5th of the 5 chord, so it can kind of sound like it was in an inversion. But if you look at the note D and G sharp, that is the 7th and 3rd of an E dominant 7 chord. But if you have A in the bass, that is not a chord tone of E dominant 7, so it's not going to sound like an inversion of that dominant chord. And the same thing goes for the other tritone created between C and F sharp. This makes for a very tense tonic chord. Personally, I'm not a big fan of this chord being used as a constant steady 1 chord. It's just a little bit too dissonant and harsh for my ears, but there are some uses that I think are really, really great and effective. And again, this is just personal taste. This is not a rule or anything. The first use comes from Bach's Prelude number 2 in C minor, and he uses it on a minor 4 chord, and the major 7th comes about as a chromatic neighbor tone. Let's take a listen and that'll show you exactly what he's doing. It's Prelude in C minor, so naturally the first measure is an overall C minor sound, and so is the last measure. But if you look at measure 2, it's an F minor major 7 chord. So that's a 4 chord that's a minor major 7 chord. But notice how he uses the major 7th. That E natural is wedged in between 2 Fs. So it's between 2 chord tones. So that major 7th is acting as a chromatic neighbor tone that resolves back into the root. Right, he only has the chord tones of the minor triad, the A flat, the C, and the F on the downbeats, so it's not on a downbeat, and it comes about and resolves melodically. That is a really cool use of a minor major 7 chord. And notice there's a 9th as well that does the same thing. It's not on a downbeat, and it's in between 2 A flats, which are chord tones. So that 9th is a chromatic neighbor tone as well that resolves back to a chord tone. The second use is in a line cliche, where you have a steady minor triad underneath, but the melody note is sort of moving chromatically between different types of minor chords. The melody note G moving up a half step to G sharp, and then up a half step again to A, and then back down to G sharp, and back down to G. That major 7 coming about melodically, and then resolving within the chord. The rest of the instruments just holding steady the A minor triad. And this is just one example of a line cliche. The other use is as the final chord in a piece, where you're expecting a minor triad or a minor 7th chord, and instead you get this minor major 7 sound. It adds a bit of suspense and mystery to the piece. It's a really great way to add a little bit of a twist at the end. We got a little off topic, but regardless of how you use these chords, let's take a listen to how they sound with some of the tensions added. The chords in the flat 3rd degree and the flat 7th degree are the 1 chord and the 5 chord in the relative major key of C major. So if you're trying to write in A minor, you want to be really careful with those chords so as not to accidentally modulate into the relative major key. There are a couple of things that you can do to help, but one of the things that players often do is alter the chord scale. For that C major chord, you can use a Lydian chord scale, which gives you a tension sharp 11 available on the chord. And for the dominant chord in the flat 7th degree, you can use a Lydian dominant chord scale, which also gives you a tension sharp 11 available on the chord. The dominant 5 chord in a minor key is where things get really bizarre because it can take almost any tension, including a flat 9th, which is a half step or a minor 9th above a chord tone, breaking that rule about whole steps. There are a lot of different dominant scales to choose from the altered scale to the symmetric dominant scale, and I'm not going to cover everyone here because honestly I could write a whole episode just on dominant scales. And maybe I will, but for today, let's just look at 2 different scales. One comes from harmonic minor, and the other one from melodic minor. The first scale is E Mixolydian flat 9, sharp 9, flat 13. And you might be wondering, how did we get this scale? If you remember back to our A natural minor scale, The 5 chord is a minor 7 chord. This does not have the same strong resolution to the 1 chord that the dominant 5 chord has. In order to get a dominant chord on the 5th degree, you would have to raise the flat 7th degree to a natural 7th degree. And that changes the harmony so that you get a dominant chord on the 5th degree, hence harmonic minor. If you then use the chord scale starting on the 5th degree for that dominant 5 chord, you would get an E Mixolydian flat 9, flat 13. And when you have a Mixolydian chord scale with a flat 9 and it's over a dominant chord, you can always add in its best friend, the sharp 9. Now instead of calling this F double sharp, we'll just call it G to make it easier. And that's how you get the Mixolydian flat 9, sharp 9, flat 13 chord scale. That F is a half step or a minor ninth above the root. But that dissonance is acceptable on a dominant chord because of its inherent instability. In fact, the whole point of a dominant chord is dissonance, tension, instability, a departure from something comfortable and relaxed. So you get a flat 9 tension tone, you get a sharp 9 tension tone. The 4th degree is still considered a harmonic avoid note, and the flat 6th degree or flat 13th is considered a conditional tension tone. Conditional meaning that you can use it in place of the 5th, but not with the 5th. So you either have an E dominant chord with the B, or you have an E dominant chord with C, but not both. When you have both of them at the same time, it tends to confuse the ear as to which note is the 5th of the chord. The other scale is Lydian dominant, which comes from the 4th mode of melodic minor. And because melodic minor, or in this case Lydian dominant, have no avoid notes, you get a natural 9, a sharp 11, and a natural 13th that you have as available tensions. Here are a few examples of dominant chords with some of these altered tensions, but remember that a dominant chord can take pretty much any tension. Next we have augmented chords, which are symmetric chords made up by stacking major third intervals. Augmented triads can be used as passing chords, but often they're used in place of a dominant 7 sharp 5 chord. These chords are really dissonant and pretty strange, so naturally the chord scales are also pretty strange. Let's take a look. An augmented triad, or major 7 sharp 5 chord, can be taken from Ionian sharp 5, also called Ionian augmented, which is the 3rd degree of the harmonic minor scale. You also get an augmented triad, or a major 7 sharp 5 chord, from Lydian augmented, which is the 3rd degree of melodic minor. The whole tone scale, which is a symmetrical scale, much like the symmetrical augmented chord, gives you an augmented triad as well as a dominant 7 sharp 5. And a dominant 7 sharp 5 can also come from Mixolydian sharp 5, which is the 3rd mode of Neapolitan minor. All of these chord scales yield an augmented triad. The whole tone scale and the Lydian augmented scale are definitely the 2 most common scales to be used over augmented chords, but I figured I'd share the Ionian sharp 5 and the Mixolydian sharp 5 scale just for fun because, there's nothing really stopping you from using them, even if they're not very common. All of them give you a 9th as a tension tone, which is a whole step above a chord tone. The whole tone scale and the Lydian augmented scale both give you an F sharp, which would be tension sharp 11, but notice that none of them give you any type of 13th. The reason is that the A natural is a half step above the augmented 5th, so that's an avoid note. But if you raise that A to an A sharp, that is enharmonically respelled to be the same as the note B flat. Now you might have noticed that D and F sharp both create tritones of other dominant chords, F sharp with the C and D with the G sharp. But the reason that that doesn't really matter for this type of chord is because of its symmetrical nature. When you have any type of symmetrical chord, in this case let's take the augmented triad, no matter how you voice the chord or which inversion you play in, any note can be the root. It doesn't really sound very clear when you play it. It's sort of the Schrodinger's cat of triads because all 3 chord tones kind of can be the root and none of them are the root all at the same time, and it doesn't really come to light until the chord resolves. And then your ear sort of realizes which note was the root based on that context. And here are some examples of the different types of augmented chords with tensions. Next we have diminished chords, and there are a lot of different chord scale options for this as well, but we're just going to look at the symmetric diminished scale. The reason is because this one scale happens to contain all 4 possible tensions that you can use on a diminished chord. A diminished chord is another symmetric chord like the augmented chord, but this one is made up of minor third intervals. This gives you a root, a minor third, a flat 5th, and a diminished 7th, it's because the diminished 7th degree and the 13th are the same note that you cannot use the terms 9th, 11th, and 13th, because here the 13th would be a chord tone and the major 7th would be a tension. So for diminished chords, we don't have any names for the tensions, but you can use any tension that is a whole step or a major 9th above a chord tone. There are a lot of different variations of diminished scales, but the rules are really simple. If you had an A here from the scale you're using, it wouldn't be available as a tension. Same thing if you had a C, an E flat, or a G flat. So regardless of which diminished scale you're using, whatever the tensions are that it yields in the scale, if they are a whole step above one of the chord tones, then you can use it. Let's listen to the sound of the diminished chord, followed by the sound of the chord with the tensions that don't have names. The last group of chords I want to touch on briefly are the blues chords. Now the blues really makes no sense in terms of traditional theory, so if you're looking at blues chords and blues scales and you're kind of confused, you probably should be. But I think that's what makes it such a unique sound, is that it almost shouldn't work, but it does, and it's awesome. The basic blues has a dominant 1 chord, a dominant 4 chord, and a dominant 5 chord. All 3 chords are from different keys, and this one dominant 7 chord is a dissonant, unstable chord that normally wants to resolve, but in this case it just sort of acts as the tonic chord. This is another example of dissonance becoming more acceptable to our ears over time. Where things get really strange is where you superimpose a minor pentatonic scale over top of all 3 chords. For the 1 chord, this E flat can be respelled as a D sharp and be a sharp 9 tension. The dominant chord would have E as a chord tone, so this note F would be an avoid note, and the G and the B flat would be chord tones of the C7. For the 4 chord, this G could be a natural 9th tension. There would be an A in the F dominant chord, so this B flat would be an avoid note, and C and E flat would be chord tones. For the G7, this B flat here could also be respelled as an A sharp and be a sharp 9 tension. The chord would have a B in it, so this C would be an avoid note, and the E flat could be an optional flat 13th tension. Just remember that the flat 13th tensions are used in place of the 5th and not with them. There are many variations of the blues, but you could use a C blues scale for the 1 chord, an F blues scale for the 4 chord, and a G blues scale for the 5 chord. Or you could use more diatonic major key harmony and Mixolydian scales, and use the diatonic tensions that come with those scales, and you would get natural 9s and natural 13s. So the tensions on your blues chords really vary quite a bit depending on how you choose to approach them. But it's pretty wild that our tastes in music have evolved over time to not only accept, but enjoy this dominant 7 sharp 9 chord as a 1 chord. At this point, you might be wondering the same thing that I did when I finished writing this episode. Since that dissonant minor major 7 chord can be considered a 1 chord, and the blues turned a dominant 7 sharp 9 chord into a 1 chord, are the only chords left in Western music that are not considered 1 chords the augmented chords and the diminished chords. And more importantly, how long will it be before our ears develop to hear that level of dissonance as a point of rest or a 1 chord? Now, I can't answer that, but it is something interesting to think about. Well, that concludes today's episode. Thanks for watching, and remember to keep studying, keep practicing, and keep growing. See you next time.